Some people have said that in my videos I have a tendency to shout, so for those of you with hypersensitive nervous systems, I'm going to spend this entire video just whispering, okay? So that kind of leads me into what I wanted to talk about actually, because I wanted to talk about stress and how stress comes in waves, and that's pretty much the same for everybody. You know, the intensity of those waves is going to be quite different from one person to the next. But, you know, sometimes those waves can be very frequently turbulent and we can feel like we're overwhelmed by stress. Then other times the waves will be a bit smaller, they'll have a bit less force and maybe a bit easier to cope with. And sometimes we may feel that there's a complete absence of any waves of stress, at least for a while. But ultimately, these waves of stress, they always return into our lives again, and they bring with them all of the human emotions that we associate with stress, like fear, anxiety, panic, depression and anger, and all of these kind of emotional states. Now, the common approach to dealing with these waves of tension that we have in our lives is firstly to try and avoid them altogether, maybe to try and outsmart them, you know, by using drugs and consuming a lot of alcohol and trying to hide from our problems. Or the other approach is that we use force, you know, and we try and invest a ridiculous amount of time and energy into defeating these waves of stress and trying to eliminate them from our lives permanently. But, you know, ultimately neither of these strategies are ever really successful, because this wave-like momentum of disturbance that we have in our lives, it doesn't exist outside of us, you know, it's not an external phenomenon at all, you know, so it's very much an innate part of who we are. And these waves are really arising because of the way in which we choose to react to the events in our lives. So trying to defeat or eliminate these experiences from our lives is not possible, really, because it's not possible to defeat or eliminate ourselves. And obviously we can be, you know, tossed around like a rag doll and smashed into the rocks and pummeled into the seabed by these enormous waves of stress and tension. But, you know, the other option is that we can begin to learn how to skillfully ride the perpetual tide of our consciousness. And obviously this is something that in part can be supported through correct living, you know, through eating the appropriate diet and using herbal medicine, certain lifestyle strategies and certain appropriate therapies as well. Now, some people will find that just exploring these areas is enough, you know. It's enough to resolve the root cause of their stress and help them to manage this stress on a symptomatic level. But for a lot of people, that's not enough. It's a very essential, supportive, holistic path, but ultimately it isn't enough, and it doesn't really address the deeply rooted underlying reasons as to why we become so overwhelmed by our emotions instead of managing them more calmly and more gracefully. And this is why spiritual practice is so important, whether it's, you know, a form of meditation or some other means of focusing and training the mind and taming the wildness of the mind. Because a proper, successful spiritual practice can really improve our mental hygiene and it can actually help us to cultivate the ability to remain buoyant amidst the intermittent storms of our own minds. Spirituality really is integral to health, you know, because we may achieve supreme strength and fitness through diet and lifestyle and all of these kind of things, but to attain a much deeper sense of tranquility and clarity and openness, a spiritual practice is absolutely necessary. And this is really a truth that has permeated so many ancient cultural traditions, you know, since time immemorial. But this really is now, it's become a type of rare wisdom that is in desperate need of rekindling at this time, because, you know, we're living in a type of dark age now, a mental and emotional and spiritual dark age, and that's why chronic stress is just so normal now. This has become a very normal experience for people. Anxiety, fear, depression, all of these things. There's more people living in these states all the time than are not living in these states. So it's actually become a kind of epidemic disease of humanity. And I think it's very relevant to the lack of regular spiritual practice in our daily lives, because, you know, this planet now is unbelievably overpopulated, and the strange thing about that is that we are actually lonelier